Welcome back to SwineTime podcast here with Spencer Wayne. I am one of the staff veterinarians here. I'm also one of the owners of Pipestone Holdings, and I am also the host of SwineTime podcast. It's a chance for us to interview smart people about cool things of interest to our customers, clients, friends, others. Today we have Dan Hanson with us. Dan, welcome.
Yeah, thanks for the invite, Spencer.
Yeah. I'll let you introduce yourself, but I'll just introduce you as my research go-to guy. What is your title?
Yeah, today I'm Director of Research Operations, and so work with the daily activities of what's going on in the barns with the research that Pipestone's involved in.
Okay. How many people work with you or for you? How many people report to you in that process? That'd be the simplest way to ask it.
Yeah, so right now we have a team of about 15 people. That'd be full-time and part-time people that are involved in any facet of activities with taking care of the pigs, working with collection of samples, and then also taking care of the facilities.
Okay. And now said facilities, what are they? I've been there, so I know what they look like, but how would you describe them to our audience?
Yeah, so really with that, the idea of the research facilities are that they look like what our producers, what the shareholders of Pipestone are going to have at home. So right now today we have 4 2,400 head tunnel ventilated wing finish barns. And so those barns are set up to be able to have multiple reps. So that'd be something that might look a little bit different than the facility that a shareholder would have. We have 2 rooms that are in each of those barns, and each of those rooms has 40 pens. So we have small pen design, that'd be 27 pigs per pen, and at that point, then we're able to collect a lot of replications, which in research is really important to be able to have confidence that the differences that we find are going to be repeatable.
Okay, so essentially a double 12, 2,400 head wean to finish barn. Just like you'd see stamped out all over the prairie.
That's exactly right.
Okay, smaller pens.
Yeah.
Right. The feeding is a little different. How do you feed them in there?
Yeah. So today we're using feed logic systems. Those are robots that are actually on a rail that go over top of all of the feeders in the barn. So if you can imagine an oval, looks a little bit like a racetrack. That robot goes completely around and over top of the feeders. It's able to fill up with the appropriate feed, whether that's a different feed type or whether that's a different phase. And it takes that specific feed to the specific pen that needs it. And the best part is it's able to weigh that feed that's going into the feeder. And so, especially in today's economy with the price of feed where it's at, it's really important for us to be able to understand how much feed a pig is consuming in order to put on 1 pound of gain.
What percentage of your trials use the feed information where you're doing feed conversion rates? Is that every trial or most of them? Or how do you?
Yeah, good question, Spencer. I would say today we're somewhere around 75% of our trials would be set up to look at feed conversion. And so we still have trials that are going on that primary parameter that's of interest is average daily gain. And so that's something that we're always keeping in mind. But yeah, well over 75% of the trials are looking at feed conversion as well.
Okay. And wet dry feeders, dry feeders, tube feeders, what's their mix? I have no idea.
Yeah, so today we're a mix. So if you've been following some of the research that Pipestone's been involved in, this year and last year we started looking at differences between wet dry feeders and dry feeders. And so we were able to set up a couple of the facilities with half of the feeders being wet dry feeders and half of the feeders being dry feeders. And so it gave us a great opportunity to be able to look at performance differences in those feeders, also look at water usage differences, and then also being able to look at management differences, because I think everyone would agree that it takes a different skill set and a different focus when you're using these different feeders. But at the same time, it's nice to be able to have both of those feeders side by side under one person's care, and for that person to be able to describe what the differences are in order to use those feeders differently.
Okay. So that's your barns. That's your people.
Yeah.
That's kind of a description of the barns. What's the history? How long? Because I watched it, but you'll know the exact dates and counts. Like, when did you get into this? When did we get into this? How did that start? How did that form up to the point of having these 5 barns on functional feeding pigs right now?
Yeah, so Pipestone Research, we started Research Barn 1 in 2008. And really important to note, though, Spencer, that it wasn't until 2011 that that was the arrival of Dr. Scott D. And that's really when Pipestone Research started to be shaped more like what you would know it today, with the formal name of Pipestone Applied Research, being able to have the oversight and to have the scientific mind and the engine behind the work that we're doing. And that started in 2011.
Okay. So that's the history. We went from 1 barn to, you said 5, right?
So, yep. So today we're at 5. And so I described 4 of the barns. Those are wean to finish barns, like what you would see at a shareholder's farm. Research Barn 6, Spencer, looks a lot different. And so that you might say would look a lot more like what you would see at a university setting. So Research Barn 6 is set up as a biosafety level 2, and that farm is able to have disease challenges in it, that it's able to have disease challenge in one room that's different than a disease challenge in the other. Mm-hmm. And through the biosecurity measures that Jenna and the staff do there, they're able to contain those viruses and diseases within the room. They're also filtering the air coming into the room, and they're also filtering the air going out of the room. It's definitely a commitment of Pipestone to make sure that we're containing and controlling the diseases that we're working with. And so commitment to go ahead and filter the outgoing air as well.
Yeah, that's a research standard, BSL-2. So
that's right.
That qualifies you to do infectious disease studies, but like not with foot and mouth disease and things like that. It's
right.
One step below that. Is that right?
So that's right. Yep. So biosafety level 2 allows us to work with the diseases that are currently present in the U.S. Okay. So yep.
So I have colleagues in other veterinary clinics that run research barns. It's like I got 2 research barns and they're doing trials. And I think I understand how they're doing that, and I understand how we're doing ours. But why don't you tell us, like, what's the difference? Because I think we do ours with a different purpose or in a different way. So you know what other people do for contract research, right?
Fair.
So how are we different?
Yeah.
When we look at our stuff.
Yeah, I think there are several differences, and I think just thinking about some of them, a lot of the work that we do is under the umbrella of Pipestone Applied Research. And all of that work would be done for the purpose of generating more information that's relevant to the shareholders of Pipestone. And so with that commitment, then we hold the level of research to a high degree. And we're also working with sponsors of trials that would allow us to be able to have the technical support needed in order to use the product right, and also make sure that we're setting up the trial correctly.
How is that different than a contract research barn? Because it's different, but what functional way?
All of that research is owned by Pipestone.
Okay.
And so then all of that work comes back to the leadership of Pipestone and also the shareholders of Pipestone. When we do, or others do, contract research, that information goes back to the sponsor of the trial. And that information is either, if the results are favorable, they go out. If they're not favorable, they get locked up and they never see the light of day. And so I think there are a couple of things that set us apart. One of those is that the results of all of the trials that we do always go out. Whether it's as expected or not, it always goes out. And that's just for transparency. We want everybody to understand what's going on. The other part that's a little bit different is we have stats that's run right here in-house. And that statistician, Roy Edler, leads up the statistics is done regardless of whether the sponsor is doing the statistics or not. And so it's very important for us to have the sponsor run the statistics, to have Pipestone run the statistics, and make sure that the models are set up correctly, make sure that we have the trial arranged appropriately, and then also that we're able to turn around and have confidence in the outcomes. Because as you know, Spencer, you have a lot of understanding of statistics. There can be differences and different ways to run something that might bring you a more favorable answer. And so we wanted to make sure that that's done correctly.
Yeah. It's watching people lie with statistics or shade the data in different ways is kind of an entertaining pastime for some people. So the transparency of the data and the double check, you kind of described where you got the stats, they do the stats. You mentioned the sponsors. So a typical contract research barn's, I'm going to describe the sponsor or the person who wants to do the research, the customer will basically say, run this trial, we'll pay you so much, the data belongs to us, sell the pigs at the end, thank you for your help in executing this trial. This one, you said whether it goes for or against them, we put the information out.
That's right.
What percent of the time does the information not, either it was neutral or not favorable to the person that sponsored? Let's say vaccine company X sponsored a trial, and of the several years of running this now, is it like 20% of the time, or what percent of the time, if you were going to guess, does the outcome not make the sponsor happy? And we put it out anyway. Some of the time, but not much.
No, I would say it is. I would say it's not necessarily common, but at the same time, it does happen quite frequently. And so I think, there are a lot of different ways to look at whether a product won or did not win the trial. And in some situations, Pipestone would say that a trial outcome, there was no difference between the products being tested.
Mm-hmm.
And depending on who you are and what way you're looking at that outcome, you might say that it was a win, or you might say that it was not.
Yeah.
In a lot of situations, when we're looking at bore lines, Spencer, or when we're looking at vaccines, and we see that there is no statistical difference in the performance of those pigs with that product between the two products, we'd say that's a win for the producer, because it brings competition to the market. It allows the producer to be able to have leverage when they're working to buy and secure that product.
Yeah, that's a good concept, because we do genetic studies. A perfect example. If you have one boar that's outstanding, everybody's trying to chase the boar, and the producer's got one option that probably costs more to get a hold of. And then when you can show no difference time and time again with maybe several products, also the producer has lots of options.
That's right.
And any individual product has a tough time trying to become overpriced, because there's competition right next to them that looks the same, or at least isn't statistically different.
Yeah.
Correct?
Agree. Yeah. Okay. So just as important as it is to know which product is the best, it's just as or more important to know which products are equal.
Yeah. I'd say just kind of watching the results roll out. A lot of times there will be a vaccine, for example, that's the standard, the gold standard.
Mm-hmm.
Another product comes up, tests it, and says, look, we're not different. You say, well, for that second product, that was a win, because all of a sudden they're also effective to the same degree. So, the producer wins a lot of times in these trials. The sponsor wins because they can show they're the same as, not even better, just the same as another product. So
that's right.
I'd say that's not an uncommon outcome to find out things are not different. Controls, negative controls, that you include those in every trial or not?
Definitely. Yeah. So in genetics trials, we often think of control being what product is currently being used in Pipestone. And so then when we're looking at pharmaceuticals, you're exactly right. Our pharmaceutical trials, looking at vaccines, they require a control. They also a non-vaccinated control, and they also require that we have a challenge. And so that's something very early on Pipestone had a commitment to do, to make sure that the differences that we find in the trial are because of the vaccine or the test article that we're testing, We wanted to make sure that when we say that vaccine A is superior to vaccine B, it's because of the vaccine that was used, because there was a challenge for that specific vaccine, not because for some reason temperature or age had an influence.
Yeah. So if you got a non-vaccinated control and you challenge, there were a few early on where you did the challenge and nobody got sick. I mean,
it happens. Yeah. And so very important to know that. And so then by having a non-vaccinated control, if our non-vaccinated controls perform the same as our vaccinates, then we put a lot of question into where you're going of, did we have a challenge? And that's very important to know.
Yeah. Who is our research for?
Yeah. Today and from the beginning, this Pipestone Applied Research model is for the shareholder. It's for the customers of Pipestone, and it has to be relevant. And I think that's something that is constantly evolving of how do you decide if something is relevant? How do you know if it's relevant? And it always goes back to the customer. Is this going to improve the customer? Is this going to help the customer of Pipestone be able to stay in the game, be competitive?
Yeah. What would be something, well, I'm going to make an assumption that you don't, everybody that comes up and says, we want to do a trial, you don't say yes. So if that's correct, what kind of stuff do we say no to? Like, people must be coming up and say, hey, I want you to do a trial. It's such and such and such. What would be a no on our end? Because we just can't run all the trials.
Yeah, that's right. And so there's cost associated with doing trials. And so that in itself, quite often, is something that helps rule out who's committed to working with Pipestone and who's not.
When you say cost, what do you mean?
So there's cost associated with running the trials.
Okay.
And so then as a sponsor, the sponsor is asked to help offset some of those costs, not for profit, but just purely to help get us closer to being able to cover our costs.
Yeah. Labor,
Yep.
More if it's a challenge, mortality, because you might kill a lot of pigs.
Yep.
What would we say no to as far as like the kind of trial? Is there stuff that's just like worthless? And we'd say, we can't do that. Nobody's interested in that. It has no value. Does that come into play or no?
Yeah, and I think that's the fun part of what we do with Pipestone Research. We're guided by a research committee. And so that is made up of multiple business unit leaders within Pipestone. And so part of making sure that the work that we're doing within Pipestone is relevant is we're guided by these internal but yet external group leaders. And so the question is constantly asked of, do we want to do this work? And the other part that helps guide us is we don't have an infinite amount of room for trials. And so when we prioritize what trials are going to be run, then that research committee helps guide which trials do get done and which trials don't. For example, there might be a trial that's on the list for 2 or maybe 3 years. It's always on the list, but it doesn't necessarily get a spot in the barn. And so there's still interest to investigate how that product will work, but it doesn't rise to the top to be able to take a spot over something that would be of more value coming back to the customer.
Yeah, that research committee or the operations group, either one. But you mentioned like who's on it? Well, the different business unit leaders, and it's like who's going to find value? So I'm going to put words in your mouth, but our production guy Troy would say, we don't care, but we care about this. He's going to know something that would be heavily influencing. I would imagine what we want to study. Our people that are involved in the actual farming are going to want to put their input on that.
Yep.
True.
Yep. Agree.
Okay. All right. So you described the barns. You described the basic process. We have these sponsors. We do the trials. There's selectivity on how we do our trials. We own the data. We do the data analysis. We don't rely on somebody else to do that. It's for our farmers. And I guess I'll plug just my own input on that. I see the research data. So, if we have shareholders that want to see stuff, you are entitled to that. That's for you to see. We do that for you to see. And we send it out in the form of parts of our meeting minutes. When we do quarterly meetings, we also will talk about it with you on the farm. Sometimes it goes out in the newsletter. But if you have questions on genetics, vaccine,
some production trials, and so that's something that I think will definitely be ramping up here in the next in the years to come. Of looking at not just, we talked about wet dry feeders, we looked at stocking densities, pigs per feeder hole, then also just looking. There will be continued emphasis on production and performance in barns.
Okay, not just genetics and vaccine, but these trials looking at our processes in our facilities and equipment.
Well said.
So those three things get looked at, analyzed, and they're available for our producers so they can be smarter and better. They get framed up. All right. So having said all that, we should recap what we did in 2021. Just a few of the trials. I'm looking at a short list here. You want to talk about any in particular without getting into detail, just like what we did and what we found?
Yeah. I think genetics is something that Pipestone Research started with in 2008, like I mentioned earlier. It's something that the boars continue to change. And also the requirements from the consumer and from the packer continue to change. And so in today's climate, Spencer, it feels like the red boar, the Duroc, is getting a lot of pressure to perform. But then also the packers asking for this red boar more and more. And so one of the things that Pipestone Research has been tasked with is to identify which red boar is at the top of its game, but then also what other boars are out there that fall under the Duroc that can be very competitive. And so today we've been testing the Norseman Duroc, the PIC 800, the DNA 600, and the Hypor Magnus. And in different trials, not all head-to-head with all four, but in all of those trials, we've seen a lot of really competitive performance on average daily gain, feed conversion, and also in their ability to be robust.
Okay, so if I'm going to recap that statement and summarize it, there's not just one red boar. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Because I think a few years ago we would have said there's one red boar. That's tests very, very well. It's a lot more of an even playing field now. That's kind of been the biggest thing genetically. I'm thinking, yeah, that's a huge finding to have several good red options.
Yeah.
Okay. What about feed mitigant? Shows up on my list as something that's another interesting finding from the year.
Yeah.
What did you find out? What were the last few years even? How would you summarize feed mitigant research?
Yeah, so that's something that Dr. Scott D has been working heavily on, and he's been gaining a lot of traction with the feed mitigants, showing not only a need, but the fact that many of these feed mitigants are working. And so using Research Barn 6, the BSL2 facility, we've been able to test many of these mitigants. I believe the list is almost up to 20, if not a little bit more, of feed mitigants and different inclusion rates. And these products are working, and many of these products are offering protection once they're delivered to the bin versus just protection during the milling process, like you might find with pelleting.
Right. So just because if you're pelleting, you kill it through the pellet mill, the contamination, the growth, and everything else happens potentially afterwards. This stuff has residual killing power or some kind of long-term protective power.
That's right. That's what he's showing, and that's really exciting because also his work is showing that in many situations, viruses can be transmitted to pig populations through feed.
Yeah.
So warranting additional effort and additional resources.
Yeah. So kind of like the red boar genetics trials, it's like, well, what's my product I can use in the feed? You said about 20 have been tested.
Yeah.
Almost all those showed some good effect. I can think of just a few cases where it didn't. So yeah, we got a lot of different options, a lot of different possibilities. So this is just one product. It's multiple. Costs may vary, but the effectiveness seems to be not uncommon for these things to work. And with a control where you don't treat it and the pigs do get sick and they do get infected where they don't with these products included, it's a challenge situation.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay. Wet dry feeders, The our producers will know the difference of that, so I won't describe it. But what did your research show?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of research available on wet-dry feeders. And so our work really didn't show anything different than what the field already knows about the differences in average daily gain, the differences in feed conversion. But I think one big thing that Pipestone Research was able to show on that is the amount of water reduction on water usage. And I say water usage, of course there's wastage involved, but to the tune of about 43% water reduction in wet-dry feeders versus dry feeders that have a floor-mounted cup water. So that was definitely surprising to our group. It's exciting to see how we can move the needle in some of these different management styles. And so you think about water usage, not only the cost of bringing the water into the pig, but then also, of course, manure removal.
That's roughly twice as concentrated manure. I mean, not quite, a little under twice the concentration of normal. So you're hauling less water.
Yeah.
And then the gain, there's some performance advantages too. I think the gain was better, right?
So we had 6 reps, and overall, Spencer, yes, there's some improvement in average daily gain.
All right. Some genetics, some feed mitigants. These are things that I think have good takeaways. We've got options as producers. And this last thing you said, man, if you're picking feeder types, there's some serious consideration for efficiency of water usage and gain as well with looking at a wet dry.
Yeah, agree.
You want to recap the whole thing or just summarize it, what you find important about our research to our producers, the folks listening? What would you give them as a send-off message?
Yeah, I think part of it is what we've been doing and, really focusing in on the core values of what Pipestone is, but then also making sure that the work that we're doing is relevant to the producer that we're working for. So that's what we've been doing, but then I think there's also a commitment to what we will be doing. And we alluded to that some, Spencer, that there will be more and more work done on the production side, answering management questions, but then also continuing to drive towards what does it look like from a genetics, what do the genetics of the next years look like, and then also how do we continue to look at prevention and control of disease so that we can use these antibiotics correctly. And so I think there will be a lot of pressure in 2022 and going forward, continued pressure of answering those questions. And so strategies for antibiotics, but then also continued strategies for vaccines.
Yeah, but you're right. We haven't done a lot on antibiotics, but I would say that's got to play into a focus going forward.
I agree.
Just because we all can see it coming.
Yeah.
All right, Dan, thanks for coming in. Thank you for describing your research. Thanks for framing up for our listeners why we do it, who the information goes out to, how it gets done. Thanks, Dan. And thanks for our listeners. Tune in next time for the next topic with our next guest. SwineTime podcast was created for the pork industry and individual pork producers around the country. Hosted by Dr. Spencer Wayne with the Pipestone Veterinary Services, the podcast contains pork industry news, advancements in animal care, and how to enhance your productivity. Monthly podcasts are available on Spotify, Google Music, iTunes, Anchor, and on www.pipestone.com.